I opened my eyes and knew instantly that something had shifted. The shift wasn't in the hospital room, a private suite in the VIP trauma wing of Methodist Hospital in Houston. The same wing I had helped fund years ago when my clinics were expanding across Texas. It wasn't in the light or the machines or the muted beeping that marked the remnants of my heartbeat. It was in the quiet, purposeful movements of the staff, who seemed to glide rather than walk, speaking with the kind of soft urgency reserved for those they believed were leaving this world. Brace yourself, because what you are about to hear is not just a story, but a reckoning. Comment below where you are watching, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. But most of all, it was in the tone of Dr. Ramirez speaking to Ignacio just outside my door, a tone heavy with the weight of another person's future. He spoke slowly, measured, as if choosing words that could not be taken back once released. The internal bleeding is controlled, but the trauma was severe, he said, his voice gravel soft. If she makes it through the next 3 days, we have a chance, but we need to prepare for the possibility that she won't. The sentence landed the way a verdict lands. No argument, no appeal, just truth. A truth I felt in my bones even before hearing it. My body had been failing since the moment I woke. Every breath a reminder of the collision that should have ended everything. A collision with a semi-truck that struck my SUV so precisely, so violently, that survival shouldn't have been possible. And yet, here I was, breathing, hurting, listening. I kept my eyelids narrowed, a habit I learned decades ago during negotiations, a way to appear unconscious while absorbing every word. The sedatives dulled my body but sharpened my mind, giving every sound a clarity that felt almost too sharp. Ignacio stepped into the room. I recognized his cologne immediately, the one I bought him last year, a scent that now carried something sour beneath it. He sat beside me, took my hand, and believed completely that I couldn't hear him because the nurses told him the medication was strong. He leaned close, and the softness of his whisper didn't match the blade inside it. You weren't supposed to survive. My blood turned cold. He spoke again, almost as if reciting a thought he had been rehearsing for months. The impact was designed to be instant. The truck's timing was perfect. You were supposed to be gone before anyone could reach you. He brushed his thumb across my wrist, a gesture that would look tender to anyone who didn't know the truth beneath it. 23 years of waiting, Camila. 23 years of watching you build clinics, expand properties, sign contracts, collect admiration. Today should have been the day all of it became mine. He exhaled slowly, as if annoyed by the inconvenience of my survival. Don't worry, the doctors, will think the complications are natural. Trauma, shock, internal damage. The paperwork is always clean in cases like these. Then he stood, adjusted the blanket with the kind of precision that made my skin crawl, and walked toward the door. Take good care of her, he told the nurse outside, voice trembling in the way audiences adore. She's my whole world. When the door clicked shut, I opened my eyes fully for the first time since the crash. The ceiling blurred, not from pain, but from the clarity settling over me like ice. Ignacio had tried to kill me. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, literally. And the worst part wasn't the crash itself. It was remembering, with brutal detail, the specific insistence he had shown about my taking Highway 59 that morning, the unusual calm he carried the night before, the slight tremor in his hand when he touched my shoulder as I grabbed my keys. He had engineered this. He wanted the end to look accidental, tragic, devastating. A freak collision with a truck, a woman who simply happened to be in the wrong lane at the wrong second. And now I had 3 days, according to the doctors, to decide whether this story ended the way Ignacio planned or whether I rewrote it. I needed help, but not from anyone he knew, not from doctors he could speak to, not from family he could influence, not from colleagues who admired him. I needed someone completely invisible to his world. A knock at the door answered that thought. A young nurse stepped in, barely in her 20s, exhausted, her badge reading Elena Ruiz, RN. She checked the machines with gentle hands, eyes soft but alert. The way new nurses move when compassion hasn't been worn down yet. She didn't know yet that she was about to become the most important person in the next 72 hours of my life. I let my voice slip out, low and controlled. "Miss, come closer." She froze, startled that I was awake, then walked toward me slowly. When our eyes met, the decision was immediate. If I was going to expose Ignacio, if I was going to protect my clinics, if I was going to make sure every dollar of my estate went to the people who deserved it, not the man who tried to erase me, this young nurse would be the first person I trusted. And before this day ended, I would call my attorney, draft a new will, and ensure that when Ignacio came back believing he still had control, he would be walking into the beginning of his own undoing. I stayed still, while the young nurse adjusted the IV lines, pretending to drift back into the sedation they believed I couldn't fight. But beneath that quiet, I was measuring my breath, letting my mind settle into the one thing I knew I needed to do before Ignacio walked back into this room. To do that, I had to return to the beginning, my beginning, and remind myself who I was before I became the woman lying in this bed. My name is Camila Herrera, 56 years old, born in Brownsville, raised between 2 countries and 2 languages, the daughter of a Mexican truck driver and a mother who worked double shifts at a laundromat until her hands cracked from the chemicals. I grew up in a house where people spoke loudly because life was loud, where money never stretched enough, but somehow we always stretched ourselves further, where faith was not optional, but survival certainly wasn't guaranteed. We were the kind of family that fixed everything with our own hands because hiring help was a luxury neither of my parents ever imagined. I learned early that success wasn't about intelligence or talent. It was about outlasting the things that tried to break you. That belief carried me through medical school, through nights studying with a towel under the door so I wouldn't wake my mother, through the years in emergency rooms and urgent care clinics, through the long climb until I finally owned my first small clinic on Gulfton Street in Houston. I didn't stop there. One clinic became 3, then 7, then a network. Not a hospital empire like Evelyn Vance, but a network built from sweat, debt, and sheer refusal to quit. I spent years earning the trust of families who needed doctors who spoke their language and understood their realities. My clinic served truck drivers, factory workers, single mothers, people with two jobs and no insurance. They were the reason I woke before dawn and the reason my days rarely ended before midnight. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I met Ignacio. I met him when he came into my clinic system as a financial consultant, hired to help reorganize our billing processes. He was handsome, charming, and attentive in the way a man is when he has learned how to make women feel safe. He was 10 years younger, confident without being loud, respectful without being shy. He admired my drive, my discipline, my ability to build something out of nothing. At least, that's what I believed. At the time, I didn't question why a man who had never worked a day in the medical field seemed so interested in the business side of my clinics. I mistook attention for admiration and silence for stability. When he asked me to dinner, I said yes because it felt good to be seen by someone after years of being consumed by work. When he moved into my house in Memorial, I told myself I was finally building the personal life I had sacrificed so much for. When we married, I convinced myself that he loved me as deeply as I loved the idea of not being alone. I never realized that he studied me the way accountants study spreadsheets, searching for vulnerabilities, patterns, assets, and exits. Over the years, I provided for us the house, the cars, the vacations. Ignacio contributed his charm, his presence, and what he called support. Though looking back, his support was simply the convenience of living inside someone else's accomplishment. But I didn't see any of that as dangerous. I saw myself through the lens of the sacrifices I had made. I saw Ignacio through the lens of the woman I wanted to be, someone finally allowed to rest. And then, slowly, almost invisibly, the marriage shifted. I became the one apologizing. I became the one adjusting. I became the one shrinking to accommodate the moods he never admitted having. And here, in this hospital bed, listening to the nurse murmuring something into her chart, I realized something with a clarity so sharp, it felt like a second impact. Everything Ignacio did was built on the foundation of my past. The immigrant daughter who grew up without room for selfishness. The woman who built clinics for others instead of building protection for herself. The wife who believed patience could heal anything. And now, because of all that, Ignacio assumed I would die quietly, leaving everything I worked for in his hands exactly the way he planned. He forgot the one thing that defined every year of my life. I don't die quietly. I don't break quietly. I don't surrender quietly. The nurse finished her charting and began to turn toward the door. I whispered her name, soft but deliberate, and she paused immediately, her eyes widening at the sound of my conscious voice. "I need you," I said, steady, calm. She stepped closer, unsure, hesitant, but curious. "Please don't tell anyone I'm awake. Not the doctors. Not my husband." Her breath hitched. "Is something wrong?" "Everything," I answered. Then I inhaled slowly, controlled, preparing myself for the next steps. I had 3 days. 3 days to destroy the plan Ignacio had crafted so carefully. 3 days to secure my clinics, my estate, and the future of every person who depended on the systems I built. 3 days to call my attorney, draft a will he couldn't contest, and put a legal fortress between Ignacio and the life he believed he already owned. I looked at the young nurse, Elena Ruiz, and saw in her the same hunger I once carried at her age, the hunger to do something that mattered. "Get my phone," I whispered. "There's a number you need to call. My attorney. His name is Daniel Cortez." And in that moment, with machines humming softly and pain carving its way across my ribs, the next chapter of my life began. Not with strength, but with clarity. Not with fear, but with purpose. Not with Ignacio deciding how my story ended, but with me deciding how his story would unravel. I watched the nurse slip out of the room with a nervous glance over her shoulder, and as the door closed behind her, I let my mind pull itself back to the first moment Ignacio showed me who he really was. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, and it wasn't the kind of moment that makes a woman run. It was subtle enough that I excused it the way women excuse small disappointments in men they still believe in. I remember the night clearly because it was supposed to be a celebration. My clinics had secured a state grant that would allow us to open 2 new community care branches, something that meant more to me than any award or plaque ever could. I hosted a dinner at our home, invited colleagues, doctors, longtime staff, and a few community leaders. Ignacio stood beside me that night, smiling, charming, playing the gracious husband of a woman who built her way upward, one exhausted shift at a time. When a colleague praised the expansion, I explained briefly how our team had worked around budget restrictions to make it possible. Ignacio placed a hand on my back, the gesture appearing affectionate to anyone who didn't know the weight beneath it, and said with a soft laugh, "Camila gets ahead of herself sometimes. I'm the one who keeps the finances from falling apart." The table laughed politely. I did too, because women are taught to keep the peace in rooms they earned the right to lead. But something cold moved through me in that moment. Not anger, not pain, but a shift. I looked at him and realized he wasn't supporting me. He was positioning himself. Nothing loud, nothing sharp, just a quiet claim of control in a room where my work should have been the center. I brushed it off, told myself it was nerves, excitement, maybe pride twisted in the wrong direction. But the next sign came quietly too. He began correcting me during conversations. Small things at first, dates, names, financial terms he claimed I had misremembered. "You meant the 2020 budget, not 2010, he would say, even when I knew I was right. "You told them the wrong number," he would whisper at events, even when the documents were in my bag. And he always did it in public, with a calm voice that made everyone think he was being helpful. Then came the first argument that didn't feel like an argument, because Ignacio didn't raise his voice. We were at his mother's house in San Antonio, and I mentioned that I needed to work late the next day to review patient intake numbers. Marisol, his sister, gave me a thin smile and said, "You work too much. Ignacio deserves a wife who knows how to balance things." I expected Ignacio to dismiss her comment the way husbands usually do when their families overstep. Instead, he nodded lightly and said, "She's right." You don't need to push yourself so hard. I prefer you rested and home. Prefer. A word that settled into the room like a quiet instruction. That night, he told me not to take things personally, that his sister cared about us. But I saw the truth in the way he said preferred, the way it left no room for discussion. After that, the requests turned into expectations. Don't schedule meetings after 5. Don't travel without telling me. Don't take on new partnerships. The clinics are enough. Don't bring work to the dinner table. Each sentence was delivered with the same calm tone he used the day he stood in my hospital room, pretending to mourn. None of them were harsh. None of them sounded unreasonable on their own. But taken together, they formed a pattern I didn't want to name back then. The steady tightening of a boundary I didn't see until I was fully inside it. The part that stays with me hardest is the night I returned home exhausted after dealing with a crisis at one of my clinics. A patient's insurance had lapsed, and we had to absorb the cost of an emergency procedure. I walked through the door past midnight, and Ignacio was sitting on the couch in the dark. He didn't ask if I was all right. He didn't ask what happened. He only said, "You're disrupting our home by giving too much to people who can't give anything back." I stood there, staring at the man who had once praised my purpose, realizing for the first time that he wasn't irritated by my absence. He was irritated by my independence. And yet, even then, I forgave him quietly. I told myself it was stress, that finances were tight, that men sometimes said things they didn't mean when life felt heavy. I didn't yet understand that Ignacio never said things he didn't mean. His calmness was not restraint. It was calculation. Looking back now, from this hospital bed with my ribs aching and my chest rising in shallow breaths, I can trace every step he took from that first dinner to the moment he whispered that I was supposed to die. The first strike wasn't the truck on the highway. The first strike was the night he put his hand on my back and corrected me, as if I were someone he owned. And I had been too tired, too loyal, and too hopeful to see that a man planning to erase you doesn't begin with violence. He begins with rearranging your place in your own life. I learned to endure Ignacio long before I understood I was enduring him. It didn't happen in one moment. It happened in the slow adjustments a woman makes when she believes her marriage is simply going through another difficult season. At first, it was small things, the kind that hide under daily life without looking dangerous. He preferred I stop scheduling evening appointments, so I changed my calendar. He preferred I be home by 6, so I rushed through meetings. He preferred I avoid certain colleagues because he didn't like the way they spoke to me, so I distanced myself from people I once trusted. Every change looked reasonable on its own, but together, they shifted the shape of my life in ways I didn't notice, until I had already bent too far. There were days when I would walk into our house and feel the tension before I saw him. If the kitchen light was off, I knew he was in one of his quiet moods, the ones where he stared at the television without watching it and spoke only when necessary. If the garage door was left open, I knew he was irritated about something I hadn't done yet. If his shoes were lined neatly by the hallway instead of the closet, I knew he wanted silence. A woman learns these things without anyone telling her. She learns to read a house the way people read weather. Small signs, shifting air, the heavy pause before a storm you cannot see, but always feel. I adjusted myself even when I didn't understand why. I spoke more softly. I double-checked the way I phrased my opinions. I chose my words with the precision of someone trying not to trigger an invisible alarm. If I came home late, he didn't yell. He simply said, "You should have told me," with a steady voice that felt like a verdict rather than a request. If I forgot something at the store, he would sigh quietly, as if disappointment were a more effective punishment than anger. The worst part was how natural it became. Ignacio never had to ask twice. I changed before he could comment. I softened before he could correct. I apologized before he had time to decide if something bothered him. It wasn't fear. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. Routine. Even my body learned him. I would sit at the dinner table with my shoulders tense, waiting for his tone to tell me if I should speak or stay quiet. I would lie in bed at night and listen to his breathing, trying to guess which version of him I would face in the morning. His mother noticed it too. She would watch me in silence at family gatherings, then make comments that sounded harmless but were meant to remind me that Ignacio's comfort was more important than my voice. "A wife must bring peace into the home," she once said, placing a plate in front of me. "Men carry too much weight already." Ignacio didn't defend me. He never did. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. As months passed, the walls of our marriage tightened. I reduced my work hours, thinking it would ease things. I turned down new clinic partnerships because Ignacio told me it would spread us too thin. I stopped attending conferences because he preferred I stay close to home. The truth is, I gave him pieces of myself without realizing how many I had handed over. The day I understood the cost was a Sunday morning when I arrived at the clinic early for a community health drive. One of my longtime nurses, Rosa, looked at me and said, "You seem different these days, Doctora, like you're carrying someone else's weight." I laughed it off, but the comment followed me all day. Carrying someone else's weight. That was exactly what it felt like. I had spent years building a life where people depended on my clarity, my decisions, my voice. But at home, I had become someone who moved around Ignacio's moods like furniture being rearranged in a room that no longer belonged to me. Things worsened slowly. He questioned how long errands took. He asked for explanations about harmless expenses. He commented on how often my phone rang. He inspected our bank statements, even though every dollar came from my work. Nothing extreme, nothing dramatic, just a steady erosion that tired me in ways no 16-hour shift ever had. I tried talking to him once. I sat across from him at the dining table and said we needed to find our way back to who we were. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He simply said, "You're imagining problems," and continued drinking his coffee. That was the night I realized silence could be a prison without locks or chains. And still, I endured. Not because I was weak, but because women like me, Latina daughters of sacrifice and discipline, are raised to keep pushing through things that hurt, as if survival itself were a duty. I convinced myself that Ignacio was stressed, that work was overwhelming him, that our home would settle if I carried a little more weight. I convinced myself that stability was still possible. But lying here now, in this hospital bed, listening to the soft hum of machines and replaying the sound of Ignacio whispering that I wasn't supposed to survive, I can see the truth of it with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt. The first wound wasn't the collision. It wasn't the truck. It wasn't the violence of metal crushing into the front of my SUV. The first wound was the quiet way he taught me to disappear, and I mistook disappearing for love. I lay still, letting the weight of the present settle around me, while my mind drifted back to the years when Ignacio was someone I believed I understood, the years when the marriage felt steady enough that I never thought to question its foundation. Because there was a time, long enough to matter, when life with him didn't feel like endurance at all, but something I built with my own hands and trusted with a full heart. In the beginning, Ignacio was attentive in the way men are when they still want to be chosen, when effort comes naturally because there is something they are reaching for. He asked about my days at the clinic and actually listened. He helped my staff unload supplies during flu seasons without being asked. He stood beside me during ribbon cuttings and community drives, telling people he admired how I put patients first. He took pride in my clinics, not because he saw opportunity, but because he saw purpose. Or at least, that's what I believed. I remember the small apartment we shared before moving into the house in Memorial, how the walls were thin enough that we could hear neighbors arguing, and the pipes rattled every time someone showered. But Ignacio never complained about it. He cooked meals on nights I worked late, waited up for me when I came home exhausted, insisted that he didn't need anything as long as we were building something together. I remember the evenings on the small balcony, sitting with our legs tangled beneath a thin blanket, talking about the life we wanted once things settled. A word we used often, even though nothing in my life ever truly settled. I was always building, always expanding, always pushing forward. He said that's what he admired about me, my drive, my certainty, the way I didn't let anything stop me. And I believed him. During those early years, he made me feel like my work didn't make me too much, that my independence didn't intimidate him, that my ambition didn't need to shrink to fit beside a man. There were vacations we planned months in advance, road trips across Texas, where we stopped at small towns just to explore their diners and antique shops. Weekends when we lay in bed late into the morning because neither of us felt rushed. Ignacio would hold my hand without needing a reason, kiss my forehead when he thought I was half asleep, and whisper things about our future that felt possible. I remember thinking I was lucky, that after years of sacrificing for my family, for my education, for my patients, for every stranger who walked into my clinics counting on me, I finally had someone who held some of that weight with me. The night we bought our house, he carried me through the doorway laughing, and I let myself believe it was the beginning of a chapter I had earned. He would bring me flowers after stressful weeks, simple ones from the corner store, but still thoughtful enough to soften the edges of my fatigue. There were mornings he woke early just to drive me to the clinic before sunrise, telling me the city felt safer when he knew I wasn't alone in the dark. Those moments were real. They weren't illusions. They were the reason I didn't notice the change when it began. Because I was too attached to the version of him who held my hand during my mother's funeral and didn't let go until the service ended. Too loyal to the man who sat with me on the clinic floor one night, after a complicated patient case, telling me I was stronger than the things hurting me. I held on to that Ignacio long after he had disappeared, long after he had turned inward, long after the warmth in his voice had faded. I told myself that marriages shifted, that people grew stressed, that external pressures changed men in ways wives needed to understand rather than resent. I excused his silence because I remembered his laughter. I excused his corrections because I remembered his support. I excused his distance because I remembered the nights he held me when I barely had strength to stand. And the truth that stings hardest now, lying in this bed with a bruised body and a mind sharper than it has been in months, is that love doesn't vanish in an instant. It fades slowly, quietly, slipping away unnoticed, because a woman keeps reaching for memories instead of what stands in front of her. I kept reaching for the man who once brought me caldo when I was sick, who fixed my car mirror after someone clipped it in the clinic parking lot, who remembered my father's birthday years after he passed, who pressed his forehead to mine the night we received our first major grant and said, "You did this. I'm just proud to watch you." That man existed. I don't deny him. But he existed in the past, not in the present. And I was so loyal to the earlier chapters that I didn't notice when Ignacio quietly started writing a different story without me. And now, in this room where machines mark each fragile breath, I understand why women stay too long, why they forgive too easily, why they endure more than they should, because the heart remembers the beginning long after the beginning has ended. I held on to the Ignacio who once cherished me, not the Ignacio who whispered that I was supposed to die. And that difference, that distance between who he was and who he became, is the reason I'm still alive long enough to rewrite everything he thought he had already claimed. I stayed awake in that hospital bed, listening to the steady hum of the machines as my mind returned to the months when Ignacio's change was no longer subtle, no longer something I could excuse as stress or exhaustion or the natural fatigue of a long marriage, because there comes a moment when a shift becomes too clear to misinterpret. When a woman looks at her husband and realizes something has hardened behind his eyes in a way that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with calculation. It began with small inconsistencies, the kind most wives dismiss at first. Ignacio started coming home later, always with a plausible explanation delivered in that steady tone of his, the tone designed to silence questions before they were spoken. He said he had extra meetings, new clients, shifts in financial regulations he needed to stay ahead of, and because I had spent our entire marriage believing he was the one person who would never lie to me, I accepted every explanation, even when the math didn't add up. Then he became protective of his phone in a way that felt deliberate. He used to leave it anywhere, on the kitchen counter, in the bathroom, on the passenger seat of my car. But suddenly, he kept it in his pocket even when he slept, sometimes beneath his pillow, as if the device itself had become an extension of something he didn't want me to see. When notifications came through, he angled the screen away from me. When calls arrived, he stepped outside to answer them. And when I asked softly, not accusatory, just a wife inquiring, he said, "It's work, Camila." You wouldn't understand how sensitive things are right now. It was the first time he had ever suggested I lacked understanding, and I should have recognized it as a warning. Over the following weeks, the distance became more structured. Ignacio's mood no longer drifted, it changed with purpose. If I returned home late from the clinic, he didn't ask if everything was all right. He asked why it took so long. If I approved a new equipment purchase for one of the clinics, he questioned the cost, even though it came from accounts tied to my work, not his. If I talked on the phone with a colleague, he would listen from another room, and when I finished, he asked who called, how long we spoke, what we discussed, all delivered in his calm, quiet voice. But calm can be sharper than yelling when a man uses it to carve into your routines. I noticed him watching me more closely, as if he were studying not what I said, but how I behaved, measuring patterns, timing movements, observing habits. It didn't frighten me then. It puzzled me. I asked if something was bothering him, if work was weighing on him, if something had happened that he needed to share. He said no every time. No, he was fine. No, everything was normal. No, I was imagining things. Those three answers, repeated often enough, begin to feel like a script. One evening stands out with the kind of clarity pain cannot erase. I had just returned from a long meeting about a new clinic expansion in Pasadena, something I had dreamed of for years. Ignacio sat in the living room, staring at the dark television. The room lights were off, the only glow coming from the hallway. I told him the meeting had gone well, that the expansion might finally happen. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't ask questions. He didn't smile. He just said, "You didn't tell me you'd be home this late," in a tone so controlled it felt like a reprimand. Another night, I discovered him going through financial documents I kept in my home office, papers he never touched before. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was trying to understand our future. But the way he said it didn't sound like planning. It sounded like auditing. As weeks stretched into months, the warmth I once relied on became something else entirely. Ignacio no longer laughed the way he used to. He no longer touched me unless someone else was watching. He no longer asked about the clinics, not from pride, not from curiosity, not even from obligation. His interest shifted to numbers, assets, properties, account balances. And the worst part was how he disguised this shift under the polite mask he wore for the world. To others, we looked stable. To others, he looked devoted. To others, he looked like the same charming, respectful man he had always been. But in private, there was a coldness in him I had never known, a precision in his silence that felt less like withdrawal and more like preparation. The final confirmation arrived in a single moment I didn't recognize as a warning until much later. I had misplaced my car keys one afternoon and asked if he had seen them. Ignacio walked into the garage with me, opened my SUV door, and held the keys in his hand, even though I hadn't seen them there before. He said he found them on the counter and must have set them in the car while cleaning up. But he hadn't cleaned the garage in years, and when he handed the keys back, he held them for a second too long, looking at me with a stillness that made my skin tighten. Now, lying in this hospital bed, with the scent of disinfectant pressing into the air and the memory of Ignacio whispering that I wasn't supposed to survive still echoing in my ears, I can finally see the truth that hid beneath all those months of quiet changes. Ignacio didn't transform suddenly. He evolved carefully. He removed warmth first, then access, then privacy, then softness. He refined his control until there was no version of me left that he hadn't shaped to his advantage. And while I mistook his calm for self-control, he was simply saving his energy for the one moment he believed would free him completely. The morning he expected a truck to finish the work he didn't have the courage to do with his own hands. I didn't realize how much Ignacio had taken from me until the erosion became routine, the kind of daily weakening that doesn't announce itself with shouting or broken objects, but with small, steady changes in the way a woman learns to exist inside her own home. There was no moment where I thought, this is abuse, because Ignacio was too careful for that. Instead, there were countless moments where I felt myself shrinking without understanding why. He began by questioning harmless things, using a tone so calm it made me doubt whether concern or criticism was hiding underneath. If I misremembered a date, he corrected me with the softness of someone proving a point. If I mentioned an idea for the clinic network, he countered slowly, saying I was overreaching, as if ambition were a flaw rather than the foundation of everything I had built. Over time, the corrections turned into quiet dismissals, each one delivered with a patience that made me feel childish for reacting. At dinners with friends, he would answer questions directed at me, as if I were an accessory to my own life. With his family, he spoke on my behalf so often that I eventually stopped trying to speak at all. I didn't recognize it then, but silence becomes easier than interruption when a man systematically lowers your place in conversations. The distance between us grew quietly. Ignacio no longer asked how my day went. He asked what time I got home. He no longer asked what projects I was working on. He asked why I wasn't focusing on the house. If I spent too long at a clinic, he would say, "You forget you have a husband," not in anger, but in that flat tone that carried disappointment without volume, a tone that made me feel guilty, even when I had done nothing wrong. His mother noticed the changes too, and instead of helping, she enforced them. She would say things like, "A man needs order, Camila," or "Ignacio works hard. You must make things easier for him." And Ignacio would sit there quietly, letting her carve small criticisms into me with a smile that never reached his eyes. I blamed myself in ways that still unsettle me when I think back on it now. If the laundry wasn't folded fast enough, I apologized. If dinner wasn't warm at the exact moment he walked in, I apologized. If I looked tired, he asked if I had let myself go, and I apologized without even knowing why. I began monitoring my own movements the way he monitored our bank accounts. I rehearsed sentences before speaking, softened my tone until I barely recognized my own voice, and chose my clothing based on whether Ignacio would approve. There were nights when he didn't touch me, and it wasn't the absence of intimacy that hurt, but the absence of acknowledgement, as if my presence had become background rather than partnership. His silence held intention. His attention had become conditional. And the more invisible I felt, The more I tried to earn a place I shouldn't have needed to earn in my own marriage. At work, I was decisive, respected, trusted with the health of thousands of families. But at home, I learned to move quietly so Ignacio wouldn't withdraw further. It is a strange thing to become two women in one body, powerful in one world, diminished in another. The shift reached a different level the evening he told me he preferred. I stopped hiring new staff without consulting him. He had no background in medicine, no connection to patient care, no understanding of what my clinics required. But he said the words with such certainty that I found myself explaining decisions that didn't concern him. When I hesitated, he gave me that long, quiet look. The look that signaled disappointment more than anger. And I felt myself bending again. I didn't see it then, but he was training me. Each small concession made the next one easier to demand. Each quiet correction carved away parts of me I had spent decades building. I slept beside him each night, but woke feeling further away. Even the house changed. Spaces that once felt warm became places I navigated carefully. The living room became a measuring ground for his moods. The kitchen became a place where I moved with precision, afraid one wrong detail would start another silent withdrawal. The bedroom became a space where distance settled between us like a heavy blanket, present, suffocating, inescapable. The loneliness wasn't loud. It didn't cry or echo. It simply existed, constant and cold, a quiet reminder that I was sharing a life with a man who no longer wanted me as his partner, but as his property. And the worst part was how easily I accepted it, because I still believed I could fix something that wasn't broken. It had been replaced. Looking back from this hospital bed, I understand that Ignacio didn't need to raise his voice or strike me to strip away pieces of who I was. He only needed time, precision, and a partner willing to give more than she received. And I was willing, too willing, because I believed the man I had loved still existed somewhere inside the silence. I didn't know then that the silence wasn't hiding him. It was revealing him. I remember the night everything inside me finally shifted. Not because Ignacio yelled or broke something or delivered one of those quiet corrections he had perfected over the years, but because the last piece of who I believed he was finally disappeared, leaving me face to face with a man who no longer pretended to care about the effort it takes to stay married. It was a Thursday evening, ordinary in every way except for the weight that settled over the house as soon as I stepped through the door after a long day at the Pasadena clinic. The air felt different, still in a way I couldn't name then. A stillness that came not from peace, but from something withheld. Ignacio sat at the dining table with a glass of whiskey, his posture upright, his expression unreadable, and his phone placed face down in front of him, as if he wanted me to notice that he didn't want me to see whatever was on it. I greeted him softly, and he didn't answer. He didn't even look up. I thought he hadn't heard me, so I repeated his name, and this time he raised his eyes with a slowness that felt deliberate. "We need to talk," he said, in that calm tone he used whenever he wanted control before the conversation even started. I stood there, still holding my purse, waiting for something to follow. But he let the silence stretch long enough that I felt myself shrinking without understanding why. Then he said it. "You're becoming a burden." The sentence didn't come with anger. It came with a level voice, steady and heavy, as if he were delivering a medical diagnosis I had no choice but to accept. I felt something inside me stiffen. "A burden?" I asked quietly, careful not to let the tremor in my chest reach my voice. "Yes." He didn't hesitate. "You're distracted, emotional, unfocused. You forget things. You overwork. You make decisions without thinking about this family. You're harming more than you're helping." Each word landed without pause, each one pushing deeper in a way no shouted insult ever could. He kept going, unwavering. "You're slipping, Camilla. You're not who you used to be. I'm tired of carrying everything while you fall apart." I stood there, listening to the man who had watched me work 16-hour days for decades. The man who benefited from everything I built. The man who never carried anything he didn't want to. And he was telling me he was the one exhausted by my existence. I felt breath leave my lungs in a slow, measured way. Not from shock, but from something quieter. Recognition. Recognition that this wasn't frustration speaking. This wasn't stress. This was truth. His truth, stripped of any softness he once pretended to have. I placed my purse on the counter and sat across from him because standing made the moment feel temporary, and I needed to understand the permanence of what he was saying. "When did you start feeling this way?" I asked. He shrugged lightly, as if the timeline didn't matter anymore. "It's been building for years. I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to hurt you." He looked at me with a false gentleness that felt practiced. "But I can't keep pretending you're the same woman I married." That was the moment something in me shifted. Not with anger, not with devastation, but with clarity. For years, I had carried the weight of keeping our marriage stable, adjusting myself to avoid his disappointment, shrinking my work to protect his ego, softening my voice to keep peace. And now, after all of that, he was telling me I was the burden, the problem, the failing piece in a puzzle I had built with my bare hands. I asked him one question, not because I expected honesty, but because I wanted to hear what he chose to say. "What exactly have you been carrying, Ignacio?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his glass, ran a finger along the rim, and then said, "Everything, don't." And that was it. No examples, no details, no truth behind the claim. Just blame, sharp and direct. Something inside me went still, not vulnerable, but steady, in the way people become steady when they finally stop arguing with lies. Ignacio mistook my calm for acceptance. He leaned back in his chair and said, "I need you to think about what you want, because this isn't working anymore. Not like this." I nodded once, slowly, because there was nothing left to argue. The man across from me that wasn't irritated, or overwhelmed, or lost. He was resolved. He didn't love me. He didn't want partnership. He didn't want a wife. He wanted ownership, control, and the silence he had spent years shaping. And in that moment, without tears, without pleading, without breaking, I felt something inside me close. A door, a chapter, a belief. I walked to the bedroom, changed into quieter clothes, and stood in front of the mirror long enough to recognize the woman looking back as someone I had ignored for too long. A woman who had outgrown the smallness he tried to press her into. A woman who could no longer carry the weight he claimed was his. That night was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply final. The night I understood the marriage was over, not because of a single sentence, but because Ignacio had finally spoken the truth he had been building toward for years. He didn't see value in me anymore. And the moment I accepted that, everything inside me aligned with one clear thought. I was done disappearing. I lay in that hospital bed, waiting for the next hour to arrive. The 1 hour Daniel Cortez needed to reach Methodist Hospital from his downtown office. And during that time, I kept my breathing steady while every detail Ignacio whispered replayed in my mind with a clarity that stripped away any remaining hesitation. I wasn't afraid of dying anymore. I was afraid of leaving everything I built in the hands of the man who had spent years wearing down my voice until I barely recognized it as my own. Ignacio believed I had no strength left. He believed the crash had taken the last of it. He believed I would slip away quietly, the way he had trained me to move inside our home. But he forgot that silence was a choice I learned to survive him, not a condition he created. When the nurse, Elena, returned to check on me, she startled when she saw my eyes open. But she didn't call anyone. She remembered what I asked. She walked closer, adjusting the monitor, pretending to chart something while whispering, "Your attorney is on his way." He sounded urgent. I nodded slightly, the only movement my ribs allowed, and said, "Thank you. When he arrives, bring him in without speaking to anyone else." Her eyes flickered with fear, confusion, and something else. Resolve. She left quietly, and I kept my gaze on the door until it opened again exactly 52 minutes later. Daniel entered first, wearing the same navy suit he wore to every court hearing, his expression sharpened by years of dealing with men who thought money or charm could bend the law. Behind him was his assistant, carrying a leather portfolio and a portable scanner. And behind her, a notary public I recognized from prior business filings. They closed the door fully, something no one had done since I woke up, and Daniel's voice lowered immediately. "Camila, tell me everything." I told him every detail I had held in silence for too long. The changes in Ignacio, the months of quiet calculation, the way he studied my habits, the way he insisted I take that route, the timing of the truck, the whisper in my ear when he believed I couldn't hear. I watched Daniel's jaw tighten as I spoke. I watched his assistant begin typing rapidly. I watched the notary remove the seal from her bag. When I finished, Daniel asked only one question. "Are you fully aware of what you're saying?" "More than I've been aware of anything in my life," I answered. He nodded once, a gesture I had seen him give juries when a case moved firmly in our favor. "Good. Then we don't have time to waste." He turned to his assistant. "Prepare the new will exactly as discussed. Transfer all primary holdings into the Herrera Medical Trust. Assign Camila's niece, Sofia Marquez, as sole beneficiary. Exclude Ignacio Herrera from every clause, and add protective language stating explicitly that no surviving spouse contestations will be valid due to suspicion of attempted homicide." The assistant's fingers flew across the keyboard. The notary prepared her record. Elena stood near the wall, breath shallow, hands clasped together, realizing she was witnessing something no nurse training had ever prepared her for. Daniel leaned closer to me and said quietly, "Ignacio believes you'll die. Before anyone questions the crash, we're going to make sure that even if you did, he would gain nothing. But you're not going to die, Camila. Not before we finish this." The document printed from the portable machine, the pages warm in the assistant's hands. Daniel read every sentence aloud, giving me time to absorb the weight of each clause. When he finished, he asked, "Do you agree?" I whispered, "Yes, sign it." Elena helped lift my arm. The pain was sharp, but welcome. Pain reminded me I was still alive to fight. My signature trembled across the page, but it was clear enough for the notary to stamp without hesitation. The seal clicked into place with a finality that felt like oxygen filling a room that had been starved of air. Daniel folded the will into an envelope, sealed it, scanned it, and transmitted copies to his firm's secure server. Then he placed the original in his briefcase, with a care that told me he understood exactly how dangerous the next steps would be. Before he could speak again, footsteps echoed in the hallway, measured, steady, familiar. Ignacio. His voice drifted through the door, low and composed. "I'm here to see my wife." Daniel met my eyes. I nodded. The door opened, and Ignacio stepped inside with the face of a grieving husband, eyes lowered, breath heavy, shoulders carrying a weight he wanted the world to see. He didn't expect an audience. His gaze shifted immediately when he noticed Daniel, the assistant, the notary, and Elena standing stiffly. His expression tightened in a way he couldn't hide. "What is this?" he asked, his voice still soft, but edged with something metallic. Daniel straightened. "Mr. Herrera, I'm here on behalf of my client." Ignacio blinked, confused. "Client?" "Camila," Daniel said, "is my client." Ignacio forced a smile, the kind he used when he didn't know which mask to put on. "She isn't conscious enough for legal discussions. The doctor—" "She is conscious," Daniel interrupted calmly, "and in full mental capacity. We have a medical evaluation confirming it." Ignacio looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time since the crash, I saw something unmistakable break in his face. Not sorrow, not fear, exposure. I kept my voice steady. "Ignacio, I know everything." He didn't move, didn't breathe. A single blink betrayed him. Daniel spoke for me. "A will has been signed, effective immediately. You inherit nothing, and law enforcement will receive a full report regarding the circumstances of the crash." Ignacio's composure cracked, a fracture running through the persona he had curated for decades. "You don't know what you're doing," he whispered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed everything. I exhaled slowly, the oxygen mask hissing softly. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm taking back my life." A knock sounded at the door. 2 Houston police detectives stepped in. Elena gasped softly. Ignacio turned pale. Danielle had called them 30 minutes earlier. Ignacio took one small step back. "This is a misunderstanding." The older detective spoke. "Mr. Herrera, We need to ask you some questions about the collision involving your wife." Ignacio looked at me one last time, and I saw the truth settle behind his eyes. The realization that his plan, built over years, had collapsed in less than an hour because the woman he believed he had already erased refused to disappear. "You were supposed to die," he whispered. But this time the words came out broken. I answered him with a calm I didn't know I still possessed. "And you were supposed to win." The detective stepped forward. "Sir, come with us." Ignacio didn't fight. He didn't plead. He didn't shout. He simply walked out of the room, knowing he had already lost. When the door closed behind him, Daniel placed his hand on the foot of my bed. "It's done," he said quietly. "You're safe now. And so is everything you built." For the first time since waking after the crash, I let my eyes close, not in fear, not in pain, but in relief. I didn't know what the next days would bring. I didn't know how long recovery would take. But I knew this: Ignacio would never touch another part of my life again. I had survived him, and now I would reclaim everything he tried to steal. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally remembered who I was before he tried to rewrite me. I was Camila Herrera, and this time, the ending was mine.